Welcome to the Sandwich Historical Society and Glass Museum's Talk of the Town lecture series. Beginning in 2015 with the celebration of Sandwich's 375th anniversary, lectures have been offered to the public to discover more about Sandwich, Cape Cod, and the state of Massachusetts. Made possible through the support of the Sandwich Cultural Council, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and Sandwich Community Television, these free and informative talks bring history to life.
Hi, welcome. I'm glad you're able to make it tonight. We're doing a program tonight relative to the Cape Cod Sea Captains. I was lucky enough to write a book called The Sea Captains of Cape Cod. It's been a labor of love for me. I'll tell you a little bit about my background, so you'll know where I'm coming from. I've been an educator my whole life. So I began teaching French and Spanish, and then I became a school principal, and then a district school superintendent in Massachusetts. And then from there I went to college life. I taught at Brooklyn, I taught at University of LIU, and I taught at Iona College. So I've always loved the Cape. I've had a house here, a second house here for 35 years, and I've been living here full-time now for 10 years. I live in Brewster. And one of the reasons I became passionate about sea captains, there are two golf courses in Brewster, port and starboard, naturally, port left, starboard right. And there's each hole has like a big plaque naming a captain, Captain Crosby, Captain Richardson, Captain Hull, and so on. So I went to my pro about 8-9 years ago and I said, where is the book about the various captains? And he said, there is none. There's none. So I said, really? So that was my first endeavor. So I do have a book. It's available in the public library. It's called Meet the Captains of the Captain's Golf Course. And once I began doing some research on the sea captains, I got hooked. I mean, it's an amazing activity that several men and women too were able to do on the sea. So I'm very pleased to write the book. So I was invited tonight to talk about my book, and in particular I have a three-part presentation to make to you. So I'll begin talking about Sandwich. By the way, the picture here, you can see how big the Sandwich Glass Company. I would say it this way. Sandwich is definitely not built on glass, but it was built by glass. There are many years where the Sandwich Glass Company hired at least half, if not more than half, of the town. You see the little boats, small boats, clipper boats, so pinky boats sometimes called, and they made Sandwich had a lot of lumber travel back and forth from Boston and Nova Scotia back to, and then Henry Clay was a famous ship that Captain Nye was the captain of, and he brought wood. There's a lot of things he would do, but he brought immigrants too from America. So my presentation is a four-part presentation. So first I'm going to talk generically about maritime history on Cape Cod. Then I'll tell you a little bit more about the Sandwich Glass Company, which you may or may not know about. And then some of the famous captains who lived in Sandwich. And then I'll tell you about some other captains from each of the 15 towns here on Cape Cod. So one of the things I began looking at was I tried to make sense of what's the correlation between the various ships, the size, the type of ship, what they were needed for, and so on. And I broke it down into 5 different time categories. So in pre-revolutionary America, all of our products came from England, basically. So we did some trading, but we basically paid tariffs and taxes on incoming goods. So that was one level of thing. We didn't really need a lot of boats then. Maybe local farmers needed transport, so the boats were a bit smaller back then. During the war, once the Revolutionary War began, we didn't have a navy. So that was an interesting period of time. The privateers existed. Privateers, kind of a fancy way to say pirate. And one of the things actually, which was a good thing in a way, when America got involved in being a privateer, we actually codified rules. So it was not like a cutthroat as it was before. Pirates could pretty much just take a ship and do mayhem and damage and horrible things. Now they passed maritime rules saying, even if you see the ship, you cannot do it in a bloodthirsty way. You have to be a good pirate, not a bad pirate. And then after that, the 1820 to 1850 was I would call the Age of Sail. That's when the Cape Cod Sea Captains really flourished. Fantastic big boats, they're called the big boats, the 3-masted boats, clippers and schooners and the like, and brigs and brigantines. And they went all over the world. They went literally. They went whaling up in the Arctic. They went to China. They went to France. They went to Africa. They went everywhere, the trade, the West Indies trade. In around 1850s, when the railroads came in, so the needs changed a little bit. So there were two big things. In the South, you have the cotton and textiles, and then the North took the textiles and made material from that. So that was a big need at that point in time. The boats became bigger, metal boats, larger boats had steel. And then the final period of like 1870 to 1890, 1900, I call it the Gilded Age, because that's when everything got really fancy. It got much more elaborate. So the boats became elongated, they were metal, pushed by an engine, moved a lot faster. So I would say even the Titanic is an example of that. The Titanic was like the ship that could never sink. Well, guess what? It could sink. It definitely did. So I'll show you a little example of each. Let me begin by talking about the indigenous people. The indigenous people here in Cape Cod are amazing to me, the Wampanoags. There are many, many tribes of them. It's kind of a misconception that the Wampanoags were not fisher people. A lot of them were. The women would go out a lot of times and gather mussels and clams and, from the shore. Sometimes even take boats. But the men, every now and then, twice a year, would go out and do what they call the padawe, which is a hunting of the whale. It was like a religious celebration. So when you think about how cumbersome that was, they had these little canoes, maybe just a little bit bigger than you see in the picture here. You could maybe take 10, 12 men, a little bit bigger, the dugouts, canoes, and they would go out, harpoon a whale, capture it, try their best to tie it up, and then they had to drag it all the way back to shore. So the only thing I'll finally say about the Wampanoags, before the Revolutionary War, many of the whaling ships were staffed by the indigenous people. And the reason that the way they would get the male, acquire the males, young males from the area, is they would allow the parents, mostly parents, to acquire the blankets and the food. They had general stores, they could buy things and put them on credit. And then once the credit became a certain amount, then there was a determination made that you got to pay up. So they would go to mom and dad and say, all right, you can either pay me now, you owe me X amount of dollars, or can your son work on our ship as a whaling ship for a period of 5 years? So most of the time they never had the money, and 5 years just extended on. They usually, once they got enmeshed in whaling, a lot of the indigenous people stayed in whaling for a long time. So they're everywhere. This area right here is the Shawnee region, but you have the Matakeesis, the Potamakas, the Norsets, the Michos. So depending where you were, one of the things which I found interesting about looking at the Wampanoags was that they were a matrilineal group. So the women determined a lot of things. It was only the woman that could vote for the new for the new chief, the sachem. When a boy wanted to get married, a male wanted to get married, a young male, he had to get mom's permission. Mom could say yes or no. And it was usually based on what does that family have to offer? Where do they live? How affluent are they? Back on their value of affluence back in the day, their reputation there, what they have to contribute. I found that whole process very, very interesting. So some of the ships, as I said, the early ships before the Revolutionary War, were relatively small. I'd say mostly two-mast ships, maybe 150 feet, sometimes less. You had Snows, which is the first group that you see on your left-hand side, and your brigs, brigantines, clippers, schooners. The only difference between all of these ships, they might have different types of names, but they're relatively small in the pre-Revolutionary America. One of the reasons why they're so small is we didn't have a lot of lumber. So in order to have a three-mast ship, which would make it much bigger and wider and longer, you needed wood. So that's when once more wood came to Cape Cod again. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Then you have the war period, the Revolutionary War period. So as you probably know, the founder of our Navy is a fellow by the name of John Paul Jones, who was a good sailor. Obviously, he knew tactics and knew how to. He had a ship called the Bonhomme, was one of the ships that he had. If you look in Orleans, there's a street called Tonsett Road, which heads out on the northern part of East Orleans. There's a little house about halfway down the street. You see a little plaque. It'll say, Captain Crosby lived here. Captain Crosby was the main gunner, not only for the Revolutionary War on the USS Constitution, but the War of 1815. And after that, he was the main gunner when they went to the lake area, up in New York State. So he was a tremendously big asset to the American cause. And I just found that interesting that a local Cape Cod man was responsible for a lot of positive activity. Now, during the Great Age of Sail, they were, as I said, you see the three-mast ships that got a lot bigger. The way they advertised the ships, by the way, back then, the newspapers were around, but they weren't that big, not as big as they are today. And they didn't have radio or TV, obviously, so they had posters. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see these were put all around town. The posters would be put in the library, town hall, all around, wherever, markets and so on. People could go shopping. They would look, and it would tell them, ship going from Boston to wherever it's going on this day. You can be a passenger, you can bring your cargo, you can bring luggage, whatever the thing might be. The ship that you see in the upper right-hand corner was a ship called the Red Jacket, which was a ship of Asa Eldridge, who was living in Yarmouth. He was a tremendously well-known sea captain for his day, maybe one of the most wealthiest men. He did all kinds of trade. He did the European trade, the China trade, California fur trade, Newfoundland whale and lumber both trade. Once you began the Civil War, in the 1860s and so on, by then metal became much more prevalent. So the boats became a lot bigger. They were powered by mechanized machines. You know about the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Merrimack was originally, both of those boats were actually a Union boat, but the Merrimack was seized by the Confederate Navy, and then it was reconverted into a little bit bigger area. They called it the USS Georgia, the CSS, the Confederate ship Georgia. So the first battle of two metal ships in the Civil War was the Monitor and the Merrimack. So even though the Civil War, even though the South didn't have much of a navy, they had a very good technology. So their sense of technology improved. They always made boats better. So even though they were outgunned, so to speak, in terms of the ship, they held their own for quite a while. In the final period I talked about with the Gilded Age, now you can see the boats got really big. That's the Titanic on the bottom. But even on the right-hand side, you'll see Alan Bragg had a ship in 1898. Terrible gale, Portland gale, one of the worst storms ever on Cape Cod, even worse than some of the ones we have now. Decimated a whole bunch of ships, and his was one. And one fellow named Collins, you can see the ship on your left-hand side there, he began taking passengers from Boston to Europe. And eventually, he called it the Dramatic Sea Venture, mostly passengers, some cargo, but mostly passengers. Eventually, that would become the Cunard line, which of course started to become a well-known travel passenger, the Cunard travel venture. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Sandwich Glass Company. You probably know an awful lot now, but I'll tell you some more. Deming Jarvis, the more I read about him, I'm very impressed with Deming Jarvis. He was a brilliant man. He knew not only how to make glass, he knew how to make money, he knew how to win friends. He was a very well-educated man. And he worked really hard. He learned glass blowing things inside and out. 3 reasons why he put his big corporation, his big factory here in Sandwich, was it was a very shallow harbor, so boats could come in and out pretty easily. He knew about the expanding canal. He knew the canal was not built yet, but he was a proponent of building the canal to make shipping even easier to go through the canal, save time to go around through the canal. And also the salt marsh was very prevalent here. So you could ship up glass in a very efficient, effective way. So they were a huge employer of the town. I'd say for several years they probably employed maybe half the town or more. Sometimes they had 2,000 or more people who were working just for the Sandwich Glass Company. Many of their craftsmen came from England. They were in Ireland. They were very experienced and knowing how to blow glass. A lot of the workers he recruited from Ireland. He got a lot of the men to come here to resettle here in America, provide homes for them on some occasions and places for them to stay. So he really developed the town. The town expanded quite a bit under his leadership. Eventually, his shop stopped. There was a little friction between the board of directors, so to speak, and he opened up a new factory, which he kind of gave to his son. It's called the Cape Cod Glass. He developed it a couple blocks away from his old company, the Cape Cod Glass Company, Sandwich Glass Company. So one of the things that Jarvis did was he revolutionized the making of glass. Glass blowing is a very tedious thing. You have to blow it. You have to be really crafted, knowing what to do. So he began a number of things which really improved glass quite a bit. The machine you see on the bottom there is a press. So they could actually make molds. Let's say they wanted to make a teacup or a vase or some other kind of saucer. You could use a mold to make that and just press the glass by going up and down. And he experimented with colors. He revolutionized it with cranberry color, blue glass, yellow glass, multicolored glass. So under his leadership, glass became extremely, extremely popular, not only in America, but throughout Europe. So many ships will be sent both to Boston as well to Europe based on his design. He became recognized as one of the best glassmakers actually around the world. The very first World Fair was in 1876, was held in Philadelphia, and his company, had the largest exhibit there. You can see a picture of that on the bottom there. So again, teacups, by the way, were interesting. Teacups, I guess, were not very popular. Before you just had like a flat plate, and a lot of times they pour the tea into a plate and drink from there. He actually said, why not use teacups with a handle? So that was, like a variation. It became very popular, obviously. So I'm going to want to talk about a few other captains, but the first captain I'm going to tell you about, Captain Roland Gibbs. He was connected with the Sandwich Glass Company. I'll tell you more about him in a minute. Josiah Ellis, Ezra Nye, Nathaniel Burgess, and Peleg Nye. These are all people who came from sea captains who lived in Sandwich. So one of the things that Roland Gibb was a proud captain of a ship called the Acorn. So if you look at the lower picture, the Acorn was a ship that went from Sandwich to Boston. That's how glass got to be shipped. And you can see it was designed for both cargo as well as for passengers. In 1840, 1850-ish, when the railroads came down this neck of the woods, he was asked to put his cargo on the glass on the railroad. And he was a very strong, independent man. Drivers did not feel he needed to do that. So he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to continue to do it with my ships. I'm going to build a bigger ship. I'm going to call it the Acorn. And there's a little pun involved with that, because when three of the railroad executives met with Jarvis, they said to him, you're crazy not to use the railroad. You should. Your ships aren't even that big yet, and you can't get them that big. So in fact, one of them said, the acorn has not fallen from the tree that will grow the oak that can build your boat in Cape Cod. So what he did in under a year, a little bit over a year actually, he built his first big ship called the Acorn. And it's kind of an inside joke that he says, not only can I do it, I will do it, and I can do it. So he did this for years, but Captain Gibbs, by the way, he was very loyal. For about 15, 20 years or more, he was a captain of only the Sandwich Glass Company. Then eventually moved on to doing Ulster coastal endeavors. Josiah Ellis was a very sea captain. He was around the late 1700s and 1820s. His big thing was to bring lumber. He would go to Canada, mostly Newfoundland, Canada, in that area, Labrador, and bring lumber. The reason why there was very little wood in Cape Cod back in those days, it was really gutted. Most on Cape Cod was devastated, was deforested from trees, because there was a lot of tries building. Tries is like a big factory that would process whale blubber. So once whaling became more popular, people needed somewhere to process the whale meat, and they needed big ovens, and they cut down the trees, and as a result, throughout the whole of Cape Cod, there were very, very few trees. That's why the pitch pine became really popular after that. They grew quickly. He was the captain of a ship called the Elmira, and eventually he was lost at sea. Unfortunately, he died in such a way it was really kind of tragic. He was right off the coast of Plymouth. He could actually wave to the people, but it was a terrible storm, and the boat never made it. So he and a seaman named John Smith perished at sea. His son Josh would continue the family tradition with lumber for several years after that. Ezra Nye is probably the biggest sea captain coming out of Sandwich. His ship called the Amethyst, which is also a tribute to whales in a way. One thing about whaling, which you should probably, if you don't know, every single inch of the whale was used for something. So they could harvest the whale, they could take the whale blubber, cook it off oil, use that for oil lamp. They could take the meat and use that, process that for meat. They could take the insides, they could use the bone structure for furniture. They could use the baleen inside the mouth for toys and combs and so on. Even the internal organs, there was some of the part of the brain, even the tongue was considered a delicacy to eat. So once you captured a big whale, they were the gold mine there. They processed it. Someone had to take that whale apart and process all of that. One of the things he was able to do, he was able to get the U.S. President's mail contract route to Europe. So that was a big thing. That gave him the opportunity to do more shipping. One of the ways that during the golden age of sail, you needed money. These ships were very expensive to build and to navigate. So there was only two banks. There was the Bank of Boston, and then there was Bank of New York. Those were the only two banks. People had to go to them to get the money. Henry Clay established a big name for himself, and eventually a big ship called the Pacific, he made it from Boston to London in 9 days, which was like unheard of. Before, sometimes it took as many as 13 days, sometimes 14 days. He did it 9 with that Pacific, the big steamship right there. Nathaniel Burgess was another sea captain from here. The whales were one time somewhat prevalent near Cape Cod before the Revolutionary War, but eventually they didn't come down this far. They would go up further north. So they had to go to the Arctic. And the way they had to go to the Arctic, they had to go around the Cape of Good Horn, Cape Horn. They had to go all around South America, up the Pacific, all the way up. And what they would do, they would have to sometimes even go like in the late spring, even late spring, and stay there for the winter. And the reason they would do that, even though they were trapped in ice sometimes for months at a time, 2 or 3 months, because that's when the whales started to come south again in droves. So there was a lot of competition. Whales were like a big money maker. So many of them, he was one of them, stood in the winter, in the ice, in the frozen ice. One of the things he was known for was discipline. He knew that the whaling ships were comprised of ships that people came from all kinds of countries, Germany, Russia, everywhere. And they didn't know each other that well, and there's always a prospect of mutiny. So he knew how to keep the men in check. He would allow them to drink, but not too much. Allow them to cuss a little bit, but not too much. They couldn't get too rowdy. So he earned his reputation as a very disciplined sea captain. One more captain I'll tell you about was Captain Peleg Nye. He came from Sandwich too. His reputation, he got a rep. He was unfortunately first mate on a ship where the ship overturned when he was out whaling, and just by coincidence, the whale opened his mouth at just the right time. He was swallowed by the whale and stayed inside the whale for hours upon hours. He was presumed dead. The ship captain said, "Oh my God, you couldn't possibly be alive." But eventually, the whale was he was actually able to slip between the teeth of the whale and get out. But he was unconscious for a while. He was unconscious for 2 days. So he lived to talk about it. And he actually returned to being a sea captain again. But the painting I have shown you here is an old painting, 1629. That's the Job, the old Bible story about the captain of Job. But we have our version of Job. We have Peleg Nye, who was swallowed by the whale and lived inside the whale for a bit of time. Next little portion of my speech has to do now with Cape Cod's connection overall to maritime history. So as you know, Cape Cod is kind of in three distinct levels of water. On the north part, you got the bay. The bay part, a lot of the coasters and the packet ships, so it's kind of the harbors weren't that big, most of them. So if you had left out of Yarmouth, or you left out of even Harwich, Brewster had no harbor at all, which is interesting. I'll tell you about Brewster in a minute. But Atlantic Ocean was kind of known for fishing. Two things, fishing and kind of the ships would be wrecked. A lot of times the bigger ships during storms would be wrecked. And there was a considered open season. Once a ship got wrecked, people were allowed to, depending on the town, every town like P-Town and Chatham and so on, and towns in between these towns, had different regulations of what you could do. Certain people could do it and certain couldn't. Like clergy were given a high priority. Women could not do it. Indigenous people could not do it. Sea captains had a higher priority. So there was some official contribution that were done to a town back in those days. And then of course the bigger towns, Long Island Sound part, the Route 28 part, that was a point of departure. There's one big area right in Woods Hole called the Pacific Guano Company. It's a huge endeavor. Guano, if you're not sure what guano is bat excrement. And why is that important? because a lot of the land, not only in Cape Cod but throughout America, even in the Midwest, it's very sandy, very not a good design. Their soil's not very rich, so they would find ways to enrich the soil. And guano would be a great way to do it. So he found several islands in the Pacific, and right off the coast of Venezuela, on both sides, off of Peru as well. And he was able to get back guano, take it on board ship, and then bring it back to the coast for travel. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about each town, and I'll just pick one sea captain per town. So Barnstable has two very big natural harbors. Probably the only town in the Cape has two natural harbors. On the north part, they have the Barnstable Harbor, which is the whale watch and the tours and all of that. On the south part, they got the ferry service to the island, to the Cape. So those were used extensively during the Great Age of Sail. One of the captains who came from that area was Captain William Sturgis. You've probably heard of the Sturgis Charter School. He knew how to make money. He was very, very adept at making money. He would travel. He began with the China trade. He did the fur trade. He did the hide trade. People got into leather and buying boots, and jackets and so on. He had a boat called the Atahualpa, which was an old name for an Incan empire in Mexico. And he definitely knew how to make money. The Sturgis Charter School, by the way, is very much a tradition here in Cape Cod. It is ranked among the top 10 schools in the country. So I think that's quite an accomplishment. I give them a lot of credit for all they've done there. Bourne's another town. Bourne has two distinctions about being connected to the sea. They have one of the oldest and one of the most earliest, the latest. At Texas Trading Post in 1624, the Pilgrims wanted to trade with the indigenous people. They wanted to trade goods, services, and so on. So they on the Manamet River, they opened up a trading post. There's a replica of it down in Bourne, if you want to see a replica of it. And then they also have since 1981, the Mass Maritime Academy. And that's a copy of the ship called the Enterprise. Mass Maritime is a tremendous university. I was reading, by the way, because of my college training, I guess. I was looking at the affluence of people who graduate and what salary they make. You can make tremendous money. One of the top paid salaries of people who graduate from either Kings Point, the National Marine Academy, or even the Mass Maritime Academy. Sometimes they begin at a salary of $130,000 or higher. So it's still a good situation to be in. One of the captains who came from Bourne was Captain Peter Storms. He was an aide, an assistant to Simon Bolivar. Simon Bolivar, as you know, was the George Washington of South America. So he was liberated under Spanish rule in Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and some other countries. One of the skills that Peter Storms had was he knew how to run a blockade. So if the Spanish had big harbors that were kind of blocked off, he knew how to get around them. He figured out a way, either through bribery or through navigation, sometimes going completely in a different direction. He was able to turn and make, so it would help his cause, so supplies he would deliver. He became so wealthy one time that he wanted to give money to a bank, a local bank in Bourne, and the teller said to him, I was reading a book, said, I cannot take that money. He said, why can't you take my money? He said, well, because the amount you've given me is 5 times more than we have in our entire bank right now. But they did find a way. They eventually did take his money. Brewster is my hometown. If you read the book Cape Cod by Thoreau, he was not impressed with Brewster. He said, much too modern, much too ostentatious, much more elaborate. The sea captain's homes are way too big. There were 99 sea captain's houses when he was there, when he traveled through Brewster. It's the only town that really doesn't have a natural harbor. They have jetties, though. You can see the jetty, the rock formation. And what they would do sometimes, they'd take the sand and kind of dig out some of the sand. So people want to load cargo or even passengers, they could walk on the jetty at low tide. And then when the high tide came in, the boats can then go out and there'll be a way, even though there wasn't a natural dock. That's one way the boats could leave from Brewster Harbor. One of the captains from Brewster was Captain Isaac Clark, traded to the first one to go way up to Russia, to the White Sea, across the Atlantic several times. And when these men that were at sea, some of them, for example, the whales usually, typical whale adventure would be 2 years, 2.5 years. He was sometimes to be at sea for multiple years at a time. Unfortunately, he was about ready to retire when he was asked by Captain Cobb to do one final run. Where that run was, he went to a port where there was heavy amounts of slave trade. So he claimed he was never a slave trader, but there was some evidence that perhaps he was. And then his boat actually contracted yellow fever, and I said more than half of the ship had to be fumigated. Most of the men would die on ship. But that was kind of prevalent in the slave trade because people would just die and it was not hygienic. So unfortunately, the wife was very, very angry at Captain Cobb, never forgave him. But he was buried in Africa, West Africa, Captain Cobb was. Although they do have in the cemetery, in the back of the church in Brewster, you'll find a monument to him there as well. Chatham is known for a number of things. One of the things Chatham is known for, because of the shoals, a lot of shipwrecks occurred in Chatham. So the term mooncusser would become heavily identified. So people have lights sometimes, and sometimes the darkness they would put the lights in such a way that would encourage ships. They would pretend there was a lighthouse, or sometimes they used no lights. Sometimes they would cover the lights. But either way, they wanted the ships to come on so close to the shoal that they would become on shore, so they can claim a prize. There was even a street called Wicked Hill, where the mooncussers would go and hopefully lure ships onto the shore. One of the captains from Chatham is Captain David Crowell. He did a lot of amazing things in his life. He was, during the gold rush, the ships that went around the Cape all the way down, he sponsored some of those people and made significant money. During the Civil War, he was the captain of the Tuscarora, which is one of our military ships, which did very well during the Civil War. Also, at the end of his life, he became a school superintendent. So I was kind of jealous because I was lucky enough to be a school superintendent for over 10 years, but I never got to be a sea captain, never got to be in the war, never got to do a gold rush, so I'm envious of that fellow. So Dennis is another captain. It's a tremendous amount of captains. I would say each town on Cape Cod literally had thousands, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 captains, if not more. In Dennis alone, they had over 6,000 people which are identified as sea captains in the 1800s. It's also a center for shipbuilding. We don't think of Cape Cod as building ships, but on the northern part of Dennis, there's an Abscasset Point Pier. There's a street called Corporation Beach, where they had a boat building area there. And then in Cecil Harbor, you had the Shipwreck Boat Yard. And they made some really substantial big ships. Really, really big ships. One of the families in Dennis, the Hall family, had a try-work. So as I mentioned to you before, when the whales were brought in, if they didn't have a boat, you had to do that. I mean, they couldn't process them on the boat. In the 1820s is when they actually invented the tries on the boats. But prior to that, you had to use the town. The picture on your right, it's not taken from Dennis, it was taken in a different area, but you see they process the whale blubber in a try. Captain Henry Hall was one of the captains. As a 15-year-old youth, he fought in the American Revolutionary War as a seaman. One of the things he did too was the cranberry growth. He figured out a way to grow cranberry. He was an agriculture. He had a captain in a farm during the off season, so to speak. And he found a way to put irrigation in, to put sand, and to do other things that really made the cranberries grow bigger and stronger. Plus, he promoted the growing of sandberries. So he showed that skill to other sea captains. As a result, cranberry bog growing became much, much bigger on Cape Cod and around the world because of him. Kind of called the father of cranberry growing. Eastham, too, is another town. You know where Eastham is, of course. And it's still open. If you haven't gone yet, I strongly urge you to take a visit. The Cape Cod National Seashore. The Captain Penniman House is open for view. Probably still open, definitely in the summertime, almost every Saturday. You can take a tour of the house. Captain Penniman's picture there to the right. He was one of the richest men in America. He's among the 10 richest men in America. So he made a lot of money, as you can tell. You see the picture of a whale being preached on Eastham. So that was another endeavor that they could do at that point in time. Captain Hoppy Mayo came from Eastham. He was a 1815 war hero. He actually captured 2 of the British ships. Harwich is obviously contiguous to Dennis. In 1850, 71% of the males who lived in Harwich put down there on the census report their job as mariner. So obviously you can see how big the boats were. So they had a log. I found a book called Log of Harwich Vessels. In fact, if you Google in Harwich Vessels, just those two words, you can read the book. And you'll see 620 ships that were directly connected to Harwich were used for sea captains in all different purposes. So it was a big sea captain. One of the captains, Caleb Chase, he had 6 sons. 5 of them became sea captains. One of them did not. So Caleb Chase was the one who was not. So what he began interested was mercantile shipping. So Long Wharf in Boston, he was one of the main, all kinds of things. One of the things he got involved with was coffee, teas and coffee. So he referred to chasing Sanborn coffee. He began making coffee become a lot more popular to America. That happened right here in Cape Cod. Jonathan Walker was another individual. He was an abolitionist. So there was word one time he was sailing a ship not too far from Florida. I was told there was an island with some sea where some of the slaves were available. They could be picked up, but they could be picked up quickly because they had managed to escape from their master. But back then there was a rule called the Jewish Fugitive Act, Return Fugitive Act, which mandated that if you did capture a slave, you had to bring it back to its owner. Well, he didn't do that. So he was caught with the slaves on his boat, heading up north. As a result, he was in prison for about a year. It took about over a year to get a trial. When they had a trial, he was found guilty. And rather than give him a prison sentence, they took his hand and they took a branding iron and they emblazed on his hand SS, Slave Saver. So kind of cruel, but that was his punishment. Didn't go to jail after that, but he had his hand branded for life. Afterwards, he went to Ohio. He became very well known as an abolitionist. He wrote books and became a speaker and promulgated the freedom of slavery for many, many years thereafter. Master, I told you about how the indigenous people became indentured servants for mailing. It's really the indigenous people who had the most dangerous work. So I was reading who did different jobs. They were never the cooks. They were never the scullery maid. They were never on board the boat. They were always the most active on these little dinghies, going out to the whales, throwing the spear, pulling it back, and those were the people who usually had a high mortality rate. There's a fellow named William Appus who wanted to stop that and try to get, but he couldn't. He tried through Congress, and Congress at that time was not very sympathetic to that nation at all. Let me tell you about Orleans. Orleans is a very interesting town. People kind of wonder, why did Orleans get to have a French name? Well, there was a captain called Isaac Snow who was captured during a war of 1815 by the British, put into a prison. You see a picture of what the Old Mill prison looked like. That was in England. Managed to escape from England and then made it to France. While he was in France, he met 2 very distinguished noble people from France, Marquis de Lafayette and another one called Comte d'Estaing. And they both lived right near the Orleans area. And they were very sympathetic. They housed him. They gave money to the American cause. They were very sympathetic and very gracious to the American naval cause. So when he came back, it was a town meeting. Eastham at that point, they broke off, Orleans broke off part of the situation from Eastham, and he went to the state legislature and says, why not call it Orleans in honor of the French people who gave us so much ability to have a naval maritime history. Provincetown too. Provincetown became a center for the whaling. New Bedford was definitely a big whaling. Providence before that. New Bedford was definitely the longest period of time. But beyond that, it's like 1850, whaling industry really became very popular in P-Town, Provincetown. So I'd say, again, half the town, or more than half, was engaged just in whaling alone. One of the ways that black American citizens could grow in a very meritorious way was whaling. It was equal opportunity. The fellow there, Absalom Boston, became a whaling captain. He had his own ship. His whole crew was black, made a lot of money, became a head mason for the Provincetown community, and was just recognized as being a gentleman and a whaler. One of the fellows that came too from Provincetown, Admiral McMillan, He was a big explorer, the excursions to the Arctic. He was involved with, he had a ship called the Bodwin, which is where he went to college, by the way. In World War I, he was the oldest Navy captain to help the Navy. So he actually fought in World War II. So if he was the oldest in World War I, he was obviously probably the oldest in World War II as well. So here's a little picture of him in his boat, the Bodwin. They had a pier named after his honor in Provincetown. It's a glass company sandwich. We know about the glass companies. I think I can kind of go through that slide pretty quickly. I'm going to skip to Truro. Truro is along the coastline, as you know, up there, Pewtown. And Captain Collins, who I mentioned to you before, began this big, dramatic ship on the bottom is the Cunard line, the steamer. So that's the ship that brought people to Europe. One thing they began doing, which was kind of the forerunner of the Coast Guard, they began the life-saving stations. So you see these men, they were paid minimal wage. They were paid sometimes as little as like $5 a month, and that's all they made. And they stayed on there year-round, sometimes 12-hour shifts at a time, night and day, and they would look for shipwrecks. And if the boat was in trouble and they knew it, they would send their dinghies out and try to rescue them and bring them back to port. Wellesley, one of the things I ran into in the 1850s, there was a big fire in Wellesley. They have a nice port area. If you've been to, where the bookstore is downtown, all the restaurants on in Wellesley. The whole area was even bigger one time and burned down. At one time there were over 200 males just out of the Wellesley harbor alone. One of the Wellesley sea captains was a fellow named George Baker. He had a boat, well, a lot of the smaller boats was a pinky boat, but he got involved with fruit. One of the things he did kind of as an experiment, he did a lot of local small trips in South America. So he brought back apples, and bananas, and some different unusual exotic fruits. And sure enough, became extremely popular. So what he did was he established 12 different colonies, plantations along the way. So they acquired islands, off of Jamaica and different places where they could harvest bananas and then send them back to America. He became extremely wealthy by doing that. Then the last town I'll tell you about was the Yarmouth town. If you go to Yarmouth on 6A, they have a little area called the Captain's Mile. You'll see like a little plaque. It's about 2 feet by maybe a foot. And so it'll say the home of Captain Collins, the home of Captain Eldridge, the home of Captain Hudson, whoever it might be. And you could actually, you could see the integrity of the home. You can see how beautiful it really is. They have another area now, which might become the Captain's Mile number 2. There's over 80, just in 6A alone, there's over 80 homes. On 2A, they have another, over by the Best River Bridge, if you head down that neck of the woods. The Baker Windmill, and those homes there from the windmill right to the area, beautiful Captain's Home again. There's another 35, 40 Captain's Home there, so that could be Captain's Mile number 2. Captain John Sears of Yarmouth was a very interesting fellow. He was narcoleptic, and the reason they call him Sleepy was he had the ability to be sleeping and his eyes would be open. So sometimes people would be talking to him and they didn't know if he was awake or not. They had to physically kind of give him a little push. But one of the things he became famous for was making salt work process in Cape Cod become a real viable option. Salt was needed. Before this, right after the Civil War, there was no refrigerators. So they needed to keep things, safe. So he began a process. He'd use a windmill to kind of mechanize it. He began, using a big farm. Before it was like a very small operation. Every town had maybe a salt works on them, but some of them were relatively small. He began a process by making it much bigger and much more elaborate and popular. He can really turn a profit by doing it. So every town in Cape Cod had 3 things. They had a trial work at one time, which had like a process wheels. They had a cranberry bog, and they had salt works. And those were all because of Cod Sea Captains. So I thank you for your time tonight, and I'll tell you that if you want to know more about some of the sea captains, I just pick one at random for my book, but there's a lot of interesting stories to know about. You can buy a copy right at the Sandwich Glass Museum. You can buy a copy on Amazon, Sunbury Press, Barnes & Noble. All the major bookstores here in Cape Cod are carrying it. But the Sandwich Glass is a great place to go. So if you could go there, that might be a great place to go. So I thank you very much for your time and your interest, and hopefully you learned a few things about Cape Cod Sea Captains. I will be working on a new book. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but it's probably something about sea captains and probably about Cape Cod. So once I decide what I want to write about, I'll let you know. And a new book will be coming out, maybe in a year or two. So thank you again for your attention, and have a great night.
Thank you to our speaker for this fascinating look at history. Thank you, too, to our generous sponsors and to you, our audience. To learn more about Sandwich history and the Sandwich Historical Society and Glass Museum, visit us in person or on our webpage, www.sandwichglassmuseum.org. Follow us on social media or visit us on YouTube at The Sandwich Glass Museum. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you soon.